Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. After midnight in Bend, Oregon, a 23-year-old woman stepped outside to clear her head. She walked toward the ridge and footpaths near Central Oregon Community College. Street lights were sparse. Traffic was light. The weather offered no obstacle. She was healthy, local, and expected home. Her final outgoing message referenced a dying battery. Then the phone went quiet. This is the point where timelines matter. Investigators establish a last-seen corridor, apartment complex to campus perimeter, with probable footpath segments and parking areas. They secure the first wave of data, call detail records, text timestamps, basic cell site windows. Friends and family try her phone, then her usual apps. Nothing pings back. By morning, missed check-ins trigger the report. The case moves from out late to endangered missing. Initial steps are mechanical but decisive. Patrol canvasses the roads feeding into COCC, logs plate numbers on vehicles lingering after hours, and notes cameras that might hold capture, campus ingress-egress points, adjacent businesses, and any city-owned fixtures that look down on the approaches. Detectives draw a search box keyed to the last known time window and divide it into sectors for foot teams. They request voluntary access to home and business surveillance within the corridor. A liaison keeps the family informed while investigators tighten the clock. In towns like Bend, disappearances don't stay private, they ripple. The absence itself becomes evidence. No cash withdrawals, no ride-share orders, no posts. A routine that was predictable turns abruptly static. That silence, documented and time-stamped, pushes the case forward. Before any 911 calls from California would explode across dispatch later that week, Bend already had a problem it couldn't explain. A missing woman last seen near a campus where late-night movement is easy to spot, but not always easy to trace. Detectives keep the public messaging focused: description, last seen location, contact number, while the deeper work runs in the background, mapping phone records against camera acquisition schedules and drafting early preservation requests so nothing gets overwritten. There is no suspect named here because, at this stage, there isn't one the public can responsibly be told about. What investigators do have is a narrowing timeline, a defined geography, and a digital trail that stops instead of bends. The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean lines can hide what happened between them. By mid-morning, this was no longer a welfare check. The case classified as endangered missing, and the work turned to time control, freezing, collecting, and sequencing data before it disappeared. Investigators expanded the corridor established in Chapter 1 and built a capture plan. Which cameras to pull first, which records to preserve, and which spaces to search while battery life still remained in private systems. In places like Bend, cooperation happens fast when a young woman vanishes. The priority is to lock the clock. Surveillance came first. Teams mapped likely approach and exit routes to and from Central Oregon Community College, arterials, side streets feeding the ridge, and lots that hold cars after midnight. They identified fixed cameras with the best angles, campus ingress-egress points, nearby businesses, and any municipal lenses covering intersections along the path. Preservation requests went out immediately to prevent routine overwrite cycles. Technicians created a pull order by probability and by risk of loss, starting with devices known to purge within 24-48 hours. Each retrieved file was labeled by source, timespan, and viewpoint, then staged for synchronized review. Phone and account data ran in parallel. Call detail records confirmed the final activity noted the night before and showed no subsequent calls or texts. With no active call, there was no Phase 2 location to plot, only sector information and timing windows that narrowed, but did not pinpoint, the last movement. Investigators checked for logins or transactions across the victim's usual apps and banking. There were none. The absence of activity remained the strongest early indicator that this was not voluntary. Patrol units handled the ground. They recontacted residents along the corridor and documented vehicles seen lingering near the ridge and campus perimeter after hours. Names and numbers were attached to every statement, so nothing remained anonymous in the file. Units marked cameras that were physically out of order to avoid false assumptions about no subjects seen. The search box was redrawn to reflect what the first round of video could confirm. where she was not, which is often how these cases move. Then a pattern emerged, not a person, a vehicle. On two separate camera angles, within the critical window after midnight, a car with an official-looking profile made multiple passes near the campus boundary and adjacent lots. Headlamp throw and the roofline silhouette suggested equipment you don't usually see on private cars. The images were not enough to identify a driver or read a plate, but they were time-aligned across sources. That alignment mattered. It meant the same vehicle was likely circling the zone where the victim was last seen. Investigators documented the pattern without jumping to conclusions. At this stage, there was no public identification of any operator or agency. The task list stayed procedural: confirm exact timestamps against the camera's internal clock, cross-check with other lenses further down the route to catch the vehicle again, and determine whether any officer or contracted unit had lawful business in that corridor at that hour. Requests for roster and vehicle movement information were drafted with narrow time windows to minimize delay. The goal was simple: either this car belonged exactly where it was, or it did not. Meanwhile, the family's focus moved from hope to clarity. They provided verified descriptions, clothing details, and routines that helped exclude false leads. Public messaging stayed tight. Last seen location, contact number, no speculation. In towns like Bend, crimes don't just break the law, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. That's why the file stayed free of noise. Every new entry had to push the case forward. By late day, the board inside the incident room had changed. The line of travel was firmer. The first surveillance polls were cataloged, the phone remained dark, and the circling vehicle, recorded more than once, became a working lead, not an answer, but a path. The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean lines can conceal what happened in the gaps between them. Investigators moved to close those gaps with verifications only the next chapter can cover. By mid-afternoon, the case shifted from broad search to verification. The circling vehicle captured on two lenses near Central Oregon Community College was no longer just a car. It was a hypothesis that could be proven true or false with records, not guesswork. Detectives drew a narrow window, minutes after midnight to the next half hour, the same interval flagged in Chapter 2. Anything that moved with authority signals in that slice of time would have to be accounted for, by paper and by radio. Bend police and campus administrators sat down with a single objective: clarify who had lawful business near those lots after hours. The distinction matters. Sworn police operate under police policy and dispatch protocols. Campus safety, as it existed in 2016, provided a different layer of protection: patrols, escorts, building checks, often in vehicles that looked more official than the public realized. That overlap can confuse a witness and, if investigators are not careful, confuse a timeline. The remedy is procedural: roster, vehicle assignment, and movement records, pulled and reconciled line by line. Requests went out for campus duty rosters covering the late shift. Investigators asked for who was assigned, when shifts began and ended, and which units were made available for patrol. They requested vehicle logs, keys signed out, odometer start and end, fuel entries, anything that could corroborate or contradict the camera passes. Radio traffic and dispatch notes for the same window were preserved. If a patrol called out a building check or a lock test, there should be a timestamp. If a unit requested clearance to move from one side of campus to another, that would help place a car against the video captures. The goal remained the same: either the vehicle on camera was part of authorized operations, or it was not. The camera footage was treated as evidence, not entertainment. Technicians stabilized frames, corrected for the known drift on one system's internal clock, and then synchronized both clips against a third reference, an intersection camera slightly outside campus that kept accurate time. Investigators did not need a perfect plate to move forward. They needed repeatability: a roofline consistent with light equipment, a headlamp signature with height and spread suggesting a patrol configuration, and, most important, consistent movement patterns across cameras placed at different angles. The more the same silhouette hit synchronized time marks, the stronger the pattern became. On the ground, uniformed units canvassed quietly for any private security operations scheduled near the corridor after midnight. That check matters in college towns, where subcontractors sometimes service facilities or lots outside normal hours. Each contact generated a simple deliverable. Either the contractor could produce a work order with time and location that matched the window, or they could not. No speculation, no shortcuts. In homicide work, clearing legitimate activity can be as valuable as finding contraband. It reduces noise so the remaining signals stand out. Parallel to that, detectives documented the campus security vehicle inventory, make, model, visible markings, and any equipment that could influence the silhouette: roof bars, push bumpers, partitions. They requested the internal guidance then in place about visual identifiers because in 2016 there were campuses in Oregon where a safety car could look close enough to a cruiser that a passerby might not distinguish them at a glance. Clarifying what the car should have looked like helps determine what the camera actually saw. This is not policy commentary. It's a step toward identifying or eliminating the recorded vehicle. Nothing from these requests was released to the public at this stage, and for good reason. The family deserved accuracy, not noise. The community deserved clarity, not rumor. Investigators kept their briefings tight: what to look for, who to call, and what not to clog the tip line with. Internally, the checklist grew. Duty roster obtained, vehicle assignment sheets preserved, radio logs pulled, camera clocks corrected, cross-street camera queued for export. Each box turned the wheel one notch. In narrative terms, this is where some cases drift into theory. This one did not. The team stayed inside verifiable lanes. If an assigned campus unit was documented on the opposite side of the grounds at the exact time the video shows the pass, that contradiction would be noted. If a unit's miles did not match a shift length, that discrepancy would be flagged. If a patrol checking buildings had no radio call to support movement across the corridor, the absence would be documented. The work product is dry by design. That dryness protects cases when they move to court. There is a human dimension here that shouldn't be ignored. When a campus community realizes a missing person case is in motion, students, staff, and parents want certainty. They want to know who is protecting the perimeter and what those cars mean at night. Cases like this reinforce a sober truth: safety signaling, lights, markings, uniforms must be unambiguous. People make split-second trust decisions in the dark. Systems should support those decisions, not complicate them. By evening, the investigative board showed movement, not movement for its own sake, but movement that added definition. The two camera clips were time-aligned. The car's passes fell into the same narrow window. Duty roster packets and vehicle logs were in hand for the precise interval requested. Requests for any additional lenses on the vehicle's likely exit path were approved. The next step would test congruence. Do the records and the video describe the same operational reality, or is the camera showing something the paperwork cannot explain? The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean alignments can hide what happened in the space between them, and that is where investigators would look next. The first breakthrough didn't come from a lab. It came from terrain. 2 days after the disappearance, search efforts pushed beyond Bend's city grid and into open country. A call brought units to a dry canyon off Highway 126, west of Redmond. The location was isolated, accessible by spur roads and footpaths that veer off the highway. Responding deputies locked down the area, marked a perimeter, and called in detectives and the medical examiner. From that point forward, every step became a record. Scene control mattered. Investigators created a single ingress and egress to prevent contamination. They photographed the approach, logged the GPS position of each evidence flag, and documented how the ground fell away toward a drainage cut. The site was treated as a recovery location, language chosen deliberately, because there was no indication the assault had occurred there. That distinction would stay consistent for the rest of the case. The canyon held the body, not the attack. Evidence teams moved slowly, working quadrant by quadrant to preserve anything that would later be tested or compared. Identification protocols followed standard order. Before anything left the canyon, the medical examiner's office completed initial documentation: body position, clothing condition, weather, and approximate postmortem interval within the limits of field assessment. Photographs and measurements were taken at each step. Once the scene log was complete, transport occurred under seal to maintain chain of custody from ground to autopsy suite. Detectives kept the paperwork tight. Who signed for what, at what time, under what case number. When a case is scrutinized in court, this is where it lives or dies, on paper, not in memory. Autopsy confirmed what the field team suspected, death by blunt force trauma. No graphic detail is necessary to understand what that means in practical terms. The injuries were consistent with a fatal assault, not a fall off rough ground, and not a self-inflicted event. Toxicology would run on its own timeline, but the core question, was this a homicide? No longer needed a qualifier. Notifications proceeded according to protocol, with a victim advocate present. The name attached to the file was no longer missing. It was Kaylee Ann Sawyer. Parallel work returned to the canyon. Investigators walked the slope again, this time thinking like transporters rather than searchers. Could a vehicle have approached closer than the highway? Were there natural choke points where items might have been carried or dropped? The ground was summer dry. It offered little in the way of castable impressions. That is common in Central Oregon in July. When prints are not available, teams switch to trace. Fibers, adhesive residues, hair, material transfers that can tie a recovery site back to a vehicle or person. Collection kits followed the same chain of custody discipline as the body. Nothing left a technician's hands without a label, a time, and a signature. Back in Bend, the incident board changed shape. Missing at the top of the column became homicide. The corridor near Central Oregon Community College remained on the board, but its role sharpened. If the canyon was the recovery site, then the campus perimeter and adjacent lots became high-probability zones for the primary assault, subject to proof. That proof would come from records, not speculation. Who moved where after midnight, which vehicles were authorized, which were not. The camera captures from Chapter 2 and the verification work from Chapter 3 now carried greater weight. A vehicle that loops a campus perimeter in the same window a victim disappears becomes more than a curiosity. Once a body is recovered, it becomes a lead that must either be explained by legitimate duty or advanced as suspicious. The medical examiner's report gave investigators a fixed point. Cause of death is the spine of a homicide file. It drives decisions about warrants, about what to seize, and what to test first. With blunt force trauma confirmed, teams prioritized searches and lab requests that could identify transfer consistent with such an assault. Biological evidence, trace materials, and items historically associated with moving a body from one location to another. Requests for expanded camera pulls widened beyond campus to feeder roads that could connect the college area to the highway network leading toward Redmond. The goal was continuity. If a suspect vehicle existed, could it be reacquired outside the city and placed logically on a path toward the canyon? Families in cases like this ask for honesty and pace. Both are served by precision. The public update was brief. A body had been recovered west of Redmond. Identification was confirmed. The cause of death indicated homicide. No names of interest were released. No theories were broadcast. That isn't secrecy, it's stewardship. Announcements made too early can compromise identifications and contaminate recollections. Announcements made too late can erode trust. In towns this size, you earn cooperation by stating only what you can stand behind. There is a human truth running beside the paperwork. People rely on obvious signals to feel safe. Badges, light bars, the shape of a car you think you recognize. This case was now demonstrating how much those signals matter, and how wrong things can go when they blur. That conversation would move to policy later. For investigators in July 2016, the focus was narrower. Align the recovery in the canyon with the last seen corridor at COCC and test every official-looking pass against duty rosters, dispatch, and vehicle logs until the paperwork and the video either matched or broke apart. By the end of the day, what had been a search became a homicide investigation with a defined recovery site, a confirmed cause of death, and an investigative plan that moved outward, campus to corridor to highway to canyon. The next steps were inevitable. Warrants for specific vehicles and locations associated with after-hours movement, interviews designed not to fish, but to confirm or contradict records, and a push for any witness who saw a car leave the campus area during the critical window. The case was building, not with speculation, but with links that could be carried into court. Within 48 hours of the Canyon recovery, the investigation gained something most homicide files never get: living witnesses. The first report came from Salem, Oregon. A woman told police she had been abducted at gunpoint from a parking area and forced to drive south on the interstate. She described a controlled offender, decisive, watchful, moving quickly between stops. She survived. Her statement provided times, routes, and details about the weapon's appearance and the way he managed her movement in the car. Those specifics, the cadence of commands, the route choices, the stops, were written into the case file, then compared against highway camera timestamps and patrol logs along the corridor. Farther south, in Yreka, California, the pattern escalated. A man was shot during a botched vehicle theft attempt outside a business. He made it to care. The wound was serious. Officers recovered shell casings at the scene and photographed ejection patterns and impact points. The evidence package was sealed for lab work: microscopic toolmark comparisons, primer residue, and any trace that could later be matched to a recovered firearm. The location of the shooting mattered. Yreka sits on a north-south corridor that directly connects back to Oregon. If the same subject moved through both states, his footprint would cross multiple jurisdictions, each with radios, reports, and evidence systems that could either overlap cleanly or expose contradictions. From there, a family reported being carjacked and then released. Their accounts were detailed without being speculative. They remembered road features, lighting, and the sound of gear shifts when the vehicle accelerated away. Their descriptions added a third anchor to the timeline and gave investigators something vital: confirmation that the offender was staying on the move, selecting targets of opportunity, and speaking openly about his state of mind. According to survivors, he made statements indicating he had already killed a young woman in Bend. Those words were taken down as witness statements, not as adjudicated fact, but they were impossible to ignore once compared to the fresh homicide file from Central Oregon. 911 calls from these incidents were pulled and logged. Dispatchers captured times, caller stress points, and location updates. Patrol units documented their responses, securing scenes and isolating each witness so their statements remained independent. In multi-event sprees, independent recollections are worth more than a fused group memory. Detectives also requested any available vehicle data from the cars the offender touched: VIN, interior trace, latent prints if accessible, and transfer materials that could survive a short ride. Even when prints are partial or unusable, ridge detail can sometimes be compared if a suspect is later identified. Federal coordination followed quickly. Kidnapping across state lines and armed carjacking are federal crimes. That isn't a technicality. It changes how fast information moves. Agencies in Oregon and California shared summaries and evidence inventories, making sure the chain of custody language matched from scene to scene. The tools were straightforward: phone pings when lawful, highway camera hits where available, and old-fashioned patrol sightings written down with good times and clear locations. License plates matter at the start of a case. Consistent descriptions matter even more when a subject switches vehicles. By the end of the spree, the subject was in custody in Northern California after a coordinated stop. The arrest process added its own evidence stream: the firearm seized, ammunition present, clothing noted and photographed, and any visible injuries documented. A gun taken at arrest can be compared against casings and projectiles recovered in Yreka. If it matches, the ballistic link isn't just a lab result. It becomes an interstate connective line that supports both state and federal charging decisions. Investigators also captured statements from the spree survivors as soon as they were medically and emotionally able to speak. Those statements are not just narrative. They contain operational details, phrases used, threats made, choices at intersections that situate the subject in time and place. What does any of this mean for the Bend homicide? It means a case that began with a last-seen corridor and a silent phone now had corroboration from people who looked the offender in the eyes. Their accounts placed a self-declared killer moving south out of Oregon within a day of the disappearance. Their descriptions of demeanor and vehicle handling could be compared with the official-looking passes recorded near Central Oregon Community College in the critical window. Their mention of a firearm connected to a shooting that generated physical evidence. If lab work later matched that firearm to casings, the spree would not be a separate story. It would be the same story, written in different locations. There was still discipline in how the information was handled. Publicly, law enforcement confirmed the incidents, the injuries, and the arrest. They did not publish the subject's name or biography into the Bend narrative. They did not speculate about motive. That is how you protect both victims and prosecutions. Internally, however, the impact was immediate. The Bend board now showed a line from a campus-adjacent window of time to a series of violent felonies committed by a single subject who, according to survivors, referenced a killing in Bend. The next logical act was to compare every element from the spree to the Oregon homicide file. Statements to statements, roots to roots, surveillance to surveillance, and eventually, evidence to evidence. From a human standpoint, this was a difficult turn. Survivor accounts in kidnapping and carjacking are not just checkboxes, they are lived experiences that stay with people long after a file is closed. Responsible storytelling acknowledges that without exploiting it, the value here for the Bend case is that those accounts created urgency and precision. They brought the timeline out of the dark and into a sequence of documented events. They gave investigators language and behavior to test against any potential suspect interviewed later. They also introduced the federal layer that would matter when charging decisions were made down the line. By the close of this chapter's time frame, the spree had ended. A subject sat in custody. Evidence moved to labs. Witness statements were logged with clarity and care. And in Bend, the homicide investigation stopped being theoretical and started being comparative. One file informed the other. The Canyon Recovery and Medical Examiner's findings set the cause and manner. The campus corridor and camera passes established the last known environment. The spree provided living testimony and a probable weapon. All of it pointed to a single chain of actions that began in Central Oregon and stretched into Northern California. That is how cases turn, not with hunches, but with parallel lines that finally meet. The next step would be formal identification, reconstruction of the night near Central Oregon Community College, and charging decisions that reflect both the homicide and the interstate crimes. Those steps belong to the chapters ahead. The spree ended with a subject in custody in Northern California. Back in Bend, the file shifted from patterns to a name. Duty rosters, vehicle assignment sheets, and radio logs from the post-midnight window were reconciled against the synchronized camera clips near Central Oregon Community College. One campus safety officer's assignment, access, and vehicle movement lined up with the repeat passes caught on video. That alignment didn't close the case by itself, but it justified warrants. Search teams executed those warrants in sequence. The assigned patrol vehicle was processed first. Exterior swabs, interior swabs, luminol where appropriate, and targeted collection from high transfer zones. Door pulls, seat edges, cargo area, trunk liners, and any removable floor mats. Technicians documented the vehicle's lighting and equipment profile because it mattered to the silhouette seen on camera. Items with potential biological or trace value were sealed and logged. Every entry and exit on that vehicle was photographed, timed, and signed for. Chain of custody had to be courtroom tight. Interview work followed. The officer's spouse provided a statement that included a claim about an accidental strike with the patrol car. Investigators recorded the statement as evidence and then tested it. They examined the vehicle for damage patterns, paint transfer, and impact signatures. They compared those observations with the medical examiner's blunt force trauma findings. Prosecutors later argued the killing was intentional, not an accident. The point here is process. The statement exists in the file. The science and the injuries were weighed against it. The reconstruction of the Bend night took shape. Timeline overlays showed the victim's last seen corridor on campus, the vehicle passes within the critical window, and the absence of any legitimate callouts that would place the car elsewhere. Digital records, key access where applicable, work logs, and any GPS or dispatch breadcrumbs were layered on top of the video clocks investigators had already corrected. The canyon remained the recovery site. The working position for the primary assault location moved firmly onto a COCC parking area, subject to proof at trial. The spree statements from Salem and Wairika were now more than background. They were corroborating context from living witnesses who reported the offender admitting to killing a young woman in Bend. When the lab notifications began to return, the picture tightened. Results are not detailed here beyond what's necessary. Evidence consistent with an assault and body movement supported the charging theory. The arrest in California supplied physical items for comparison, firearm, clothing, trace, that could be matched or excluded against the Oregon evidence. Together, those streams allowed detectives to name the suspect publicly for the first time, Edwin Enoch Lara, a campus safety officer assigned to COCC during the relevant period. Announcements stayed specific and restrained. Investigators identified the defendant, confirmed the homicide finding, and emphasized that the canyon was the recovery location. They did not speculate about motive. They underscored that the case rested on records, science, and witness accounts gathered across 2 states. In towns like Bend, trust is earned by what you can show, not what you can say. 18 months after the disappearance, the homicide file moved from lab benches to a courtroom. On January 22, 2018, in Deschutes County Circuit Court, the defendant stood with counsel and entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder for the killing of Kaylee Ann Sawyer. The judge conducted the standard colloquy: competency, voluntariness, factual basis. The state summarized the evidence already secured. Last seen placement near Central Oregon Community College, the post-midnight vehicle movements tied to the assigned campus safety car, medical examiner findings of blunt force trauma, recovery in the canyon off Highway 126, and corroboration drawn from the interstate spree and witness statements. The court found the plea knowing and voluntary. The agreement took the death penalty off the table in exchange for a guaranteed life term. In Oregon practice, that meant life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no speculation about motive in the record. The state stayed inside its proofs. The defense stipulated to the elements of aggravated murder and reserved no right to withdraw. With the plea accepted, the judge imposed sentence. A victim's advocate stood with the family. Impact statements were heard, measured, specific, focused on the person whose name anchored the case. The court entered final judgment. A plea of this kind does not erase the need for precision. The canyon remained defined as the recovery site. The prosecution's position on the primary assault location within a COCC parking area was preserved in the state's narrative of proof. The court's role was not to relitigate the lab work. It was to determine whether sufficient facts supported the plea. They did. The state recited the chain of custody structure, the timeline built from rosters and dispatch records, and the survivor accounts from Oregon and California that placed the same subject in a sequence of violent acts within days of the homicide. The framework held. For the family, finality matters. A guaranteed life term spares them a capital trial and the open-ended appeals that follow. For investigators, it locks in the work product, the vehicle processing, the digital reconciliations, the autopsy conclusions, and the comparative evidence that tied an arrest in California back to a homicide in Central Oregon. The case now had a single, court-recognized outcome at the state level: no parole, no ambiguity about custody status. Public communication stayed narrowly factual. Authorities announced the conviction and sentence, restated the essential scene distinctions, and confirmed that separate federal charges tied to the interstate crimes were proceeding on their own track. That note wasn't an alternate ending. It was a jurisdictional fact. The Oregon case was complete. In towns like Bend, closure is never clean, but clarity helps. The system did what it is designed to do: match evidence to elements, convert findings to a lawful judgment, and protect that judgment against challenge. The file that began with a missing person report ended here with a life term, recorded and enforceable. After Oregon closed its case with a guilty plea and life without parole, the file moved to a second arena: the interstate crimes that followed the homicide. Kidnapping in Oregon, a shooting and carjacking in Northern California triggered federal jurisdiction. In 2019, in USD District Court, Edwin Enoch Lara entered guilty pleas for the federal counts tied to that 2-day spree. The judge imposed a federal life sentence in addition to the Oregon life term. It wasn't a second story or an alternate ending. It was the same offender, the same chain of conduct, answered at two levels of law. The federal case stood on survivors and evidence that did not require interpretation. 911 recordings captured the timeline as it unfolded. Witness statements described the same controlled behavior across multiple scenes. Ballistic comparisons linked recovered casings to a seized firearm. Travel records and highway cameras placed the subject on a corridor that leads directly back towards Central Oregon. In combination with the Oregon proof, the last seen placement near the COCC perimeter, the vehicle movements reconciled to duty logs, the canyon recovery west of Redmond, and the medical examiner's blunt force homicide finding, the federal outcome created a simple reality: there is no path to release. Life means life. What followed in Oregon was policy, not theater. In 2019, the state enacted Kaylee's law, requiring clear visual separation between campus safety vehicles and police patrol cars, and setting standards for equipment, markings, and accountability tools like GPS and recording dispatch retention. Uniforms had to be distinguishable. Light bars and push bumpers that could mimic law enforcement were restricted. The point wasn't politics, it was clarity. People make fast trust decisions in the dark. The system should support those decisions with signals that are unambiguous. Civil accountability moved on its own track. In 2020, Central Oregon Community College reached a $2,000 settlement with Kaylee's family. Civil resolutions cannot reverse a crime, but they can acknowledge institutional responsibilities and fund advocacy or memorial efforts that carry a name forward in ways a criminal judgment cannot. Families measure justice in more than one register: a sentence, a safeguard, and a remembrance. By September 15, 2025, Lara remains incarcerated under life, Oregon, plus life, federal. There is no parole date to debate and no competing narrative about custody status. The prosecution's position on the primary assault location within a COCC parking area and the established recovery site, a canyon off Highway 126 west of Redmond, have stayed consistent from charge to sentence. The record is the record. There is a human through line to close on. A true crime account should not end on the offender, but on what the case teaches without exploiting grief. Here, the lesson is concrete. Trust cues matter. Policies must reflect that. Cooperation across agencies saves time when the window is narrow. In towns like Bend, where shared spaces feel safe by default, the difference between a look-alike and the real thing isn't semantic. It is operational. The adjustments Oregon made are the kind that prevent confusion at 1 a.m., when a single mistaken assumption can carry a person into danger. Kaylee Ann Sawyer's name is not a footnote to a policy bill or a line in a judgment. It is the reason the case was worked with precision from a last-seen corridor to a courtroom. The reason a recovery site was kept distinct from an assault location. The reason evidence, not speculation, drove decisions at each step. If there is value for viewers beyond the facts, it is this: know the systems where you live, ask for clarity from the institutions that patrol your shared spaces, and remember that change often comes because one family asked the right questions and refused to stop. One case, one offender, two sentences that will never unwind. Oregon's life without parole, 2018, stands. The federal life term, 2019, stands. As of 2025, both are in force. The legacy is not only a conviction, but a clearer, safer standard for the next person walking home at night. Looking back on Kaylee's story, I'm reminded that safety isn't something we can take for granted. It's built through awareness, accountability, and the courage to demand better systems. Her life and legacy prove that change can come, even from tragedy. As someone who's walked you through this case, my hope is that you carry forward both vigilance and compassion. What do you think communities should do differently to keep people safe? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or why this case resonates with you. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.